So I'm now happy to hand over for our keynote. I'm really pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Kevin Gosling, Collections Trust's Chief Executive. So I'm going to hand over to Kevin. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And good morning, everybody, and welcome to this year's Collections Trust conference. Now, I wouldn't normally hog the keynote slot, but as Laura said, we just launched this thing, the Museum Data Service, and that really is quite a moment in the, as you'll hear, sort of fairly long history of trying to work with collections data over the years. And it's something that I've been thinking about actually for quite a while. In fact, since the mid 1990s, I used to work for Collections Trust when it was known as the Museum Documentation Association. And, you know, within 2 or 3 years of the World Wide Web becoming a thing in the early 90s, museums were quick to kind of grasp the strategic opportunities, and MDA had some workshops, and people from all sorts of museums and kind of policy-making bodies really kind of try to think about what this new technology could do to help us work strategically across the nation's collections. Now, there were some false dawns, and I'll name check some of those as I go along. But a mere 28 years later, I'm thrilled that we have just launched the means to put some of these long-held ideas into practice, and that is the Museum Data Service. Hopefully, some of you have heard about it already and possibly even found your way to the website, museumdata.uk. So Museum Data Service is a free new service. It's a collaboration between Collections Trust, working with Art UK and the University of Leicester. It was built with startup funding from Bloomberg Philanthropies and is now funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council out of its infrastructure fund for digital arts and humanities. Now, the strapline is all about connecting and sharing object records. And I'll talk about object records later, but that's only one of several kinds of data that we're actually interested in. So I'm just going to quickly run through the data hierarchy that we have, which just sums up the different kinds of collections data that we're going to be talking about during the day. So at the top level, institutions, but museums, museum-like organizations, just sort of getting a grip on, you know, what we have in the country, what they're called, correct relationships between them, that kind of thing. Level 2 is the collections that they hold at a kind of high level. And then level 3, the detailed records regarding individual objects or groups of objects. And then at level 4, just the much bigger mass of information that relates to object records, exhibition text, significance reviews, and other kinds of content, but also images that relate to them. So as I'm talking, just we'll kind of keep coming back to this hierarchy of data. So starting with level 1, I mean, you would think that there would be an authoritative and current list of UK museums. Not so much, we're getting there, but there used to be a thing called the Digest of Museum Statistics. This was started in 1994, ran till the late 90s. It was run by the Museums and Galleries Commission, initially as a way of talking about the designated collections, and then it was expanded to take in what were then called registered museums and are now accredited museums. That didn't really survive the transition between the Museums and Galleries Commission and its successor body, and that database now lives with the National Archives as an archive data set. Really interesting, actually, just to read all about it and some of the problems that it encountered and perhaps why it's no longer still current. 1999, there was a big fanfare. The 24-hour museum was launched, which included a database of all the museums in the country and their facilities, and then kind of morphed into Culture24 and then Museum Crush, and changed its focus a little bit. But at its core, it was a list of museums. We've also had a major academic research project, again funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, AHRC, called Mapping Museums, which has looked not just at accredited museums, but non-accredited ones as well, and in particular did a massive piece of work looking at museum openings and closures over several decades, and all of that data is there. But it didn't quite meet the needs that we had for the Museum Data Service. So we took as our starting point the list of accredited museums that is available via the Arts Council England website on behalf of the 4 accreditation partners. And that lists all of the accredited museums, but there are problems with this list for our purposes, not least the fact that museums keep changing their names. I mean, the London Museum, which was the Museum of London, is just the sort of latest example of that. And museums rebrand all the time. Many are known by various names, even on their own same website. And this list also doesn't really capture the relationship between individual branch museums and museum services. So from our point of view, we just needed to know which were standalone museums, which were museum services, and which were branches of museum services. So what we've done is to, as part of the Museum Data Service interface, is we've pulled together what we think is a reasonably accurate and up-to-date list of current museum names, and these are listed alphabetically. You can see here we've got single museum icons. That signifies that this is either a standalone museum or a branch of a museum service. Or you can have a grouped view where a double museum icon means that this is a museum service. And in each case, we've gone through and used the current museum name. If you open up a record, you can see, for example, in this case, the museums that are part of Aberdeen Archives, Gallery and Museums. You can see alternative names for that service, other information such as, actually, this is a recognised collection, the Scottish equivalent of a designated collection. The point about alternative names is really, really important. For example, you might come across legacy records that talk about Devizes Museum, and that's now known as Wiltshire Museum. So we've taken the opportunity to just pull together previous names so that if these come up in legacy documentation and legacy records, then it's clear which institution they're talking about. And we've also, you'll see at the top, there's a Wikidata ID. Now, Wikidata is Wikipedia's nerdy cousin, and it's just a fantastically useful open source resource. And so what we've done in each case is linked to existing Wikidata entries, and where those didn't exist, we've added to them, so that we've now got not just a string of text, Wiltshire Museum, but actually a link to an authority file in Wikidata. And then with that, we can then pull in all sorts of other information if we wanted to, geographic coordinates, addresses, and then also links to other authority files, such as mapping museums, and then even links to things like TripAdvisor. So we've got a really useful resource that starts to take individual museum names and turn them into just points of linked data that you can then do things with. And that was important because that was the kind of first step to really being able to pull together some high-level information about collections. So we needed that initial framework. And wouldn't it be really, really useful in the way that you can with archives, where the concept of finding aids is really common? Wouldn't it be really useful if every museum had a summary description of the scope of its collection and its strengths? Well, in fact, every accredited museum does have that. So the accreditation standard requires each accredited museum to submit a collection development policy, And as part of that, it needs to have an overview of the collection. So every single accredited museum has spent time pulling together what are potentially really, really useful paragraphs of text. And what we did was to go, individually to each museum and museum service and ask them to share those collection overviews with us. And then we strip them out, we turn them into HTML, and where possible, we published them on the Museum Data Service site. And slightly disappointingly, we only got about 348 responses, representing something like 650 accredited museums. We'll have another crack now that the site is up and running and people can see what we're talking about, because already it is fantastically useful. So if you were interested in, which museums have Bronze Age material, you can just type that in to the interface and then you will get a list. Sometimes the mention is quite general. So there we go, Butte Museum has Bronze Age material. Sometimes there's a lot more detail. So in this case, Chertsey Museum seems to have a fairly unique example of a Bronze Age socketed axe, complete with a wooden handle. So if I was interested in Bronze Age material, immediately just at that level, that is incredibly useful information to me, which I can get relatively quickly now through the interface on the Museum Data Service. And we'll carry on trying to pull together as many collection current collection development review overviews as we can over coming months. And if your museum isn't on here, then we'd be delighted to hear from you and add them. So where necessary, we've actually plugged gaps with a legacy data from an initiative called Cornucopia, which dates all the way back to 1998 and sort of lasted for about 10 years before fizzling out. And this is really a great example of how we're able to kind of reuse data that was created at enormous expense and effort back in the day, and actually is still useful. And again, these records vary from just very, very outline lists of keywords through to very dense screeds of text, but as ways of guiding researchers and curators to museums that hold potentially interesting and useful information. This is really, really good, solid information. And I think we will carry on pulling this kind of thing together. As I was going through the Cornucopia records, I was struck by the fact that in some cases, all we know about a museum's collections is that it has ancient Egyptian collections. And these seem to be kind of traces of a far distant survey that presumably one of the subject specialist networks did, going up and down the country's museums and looking in detail, and sometimes very great detail, at the Egyptian collections. And so that is work that happened, I don't know when. If anybody knows, I'd be interested to hear about it, decades ago. But because that data found its way into a data set that still kind of is clinging on by its fingernails, we've been able to repurpose it and make it available. And so there are many, many collection reviews that I know have taken place. Suzanne Keen's 2008 publication, Collections for People, has an appendix which lists just a ton of reviews that had happened up till that date. And I don't know where you would start to even track down any of those. And there have been many since then, often carried out by subject specialist networks. And I know we've got Justine Riley as one of our panelists later on. And subject specialist networks are fantastically important parts of the museum ecosystem, but they are loose affiliations of specialist curators working together on projects, and they're not geared up to manage and preserve complex data sets. So the history of kind of collection reviews in recent decades is just littered with examples where funding has gone into projects by subject specialist networks and other projects to do really, really useful research, going and looking at whatever kind of collection it is in museums up and down the country. And this kind of information is really important because it allows us to start to understand the relative significance of collections. So we think that there's great scope for a project to pull together, track down and rescue legacy collection reviews, to try and repurpose that data and make it available through the Museum Data Service so that it can be searched and be useful. But also let's kind of try and find ways that the Museum Data Service can be a repository for the excellent work that subject specialist networks do. And finally, just on collection level information, let's not forget that there are also other sources of information that we can pull in. And I want to start experimenting with, for example, you pulling in collection level descriptions from Wikipedia pages, which again sometimes contain useful and in this particular case the surprising information that the Andrew Carnegie Birthplace Museum has examples of puppets from Sesame Street. Who knew? So there's all kinds of data out there, and the Museum Data Service now gives us a means of pulling all of those different sources together into useful finding aids. So that's our collection level information. Now, turning to individual object records. So you can, as of our launch a few weeks ago, you can start searching across object records. So the problem that we were trying to solve here was that there are something like 80 million existing object records. We think fewer than half of those are available online anywhere. And even if they are available online, they're spread across hundreds of individual museum websites. And it's not clear that apart from looking at that data, you can really do anything useful with it in the sense of putting that data to work. So what we've done is at launch, we brought together about 3 million records from 21 institutions. We think it might take up to a decade to bring together all records from all museums, but we've already got about 150 museums have expressed interest, and between them, those institutions have about 10 million records. So, we're just having launched, we're now kind of working our way through those people who've expressed interest. Again, we'd be delighted to hear from others, UK museums who would like to be part of this. There's an express interest form on the website. And here's just an example of what you could expect to find. Now, I came into museums via research into medieval runic inscriptions. So I was naturally kind of curious, well, okay, what objects have we got in the 21 institutions so far that have runic inscriptions on them? So I just did a quick search and found about 55 of those. You can see that you get the core fields displayed, and then if you click on the little triangle to the right, you can open up the record and you get as much detail as the museum has supplied and is willing to make public. I'll say a little bit more about that later. Now, you might be looking at this going, well, actually, this looks pretty no frills. This is quite utilitarian, and that is deliberately so. So this is not, I mean, although it is available to the public, it's not intended to be the kind of the nice, pretty portal for the general consumer. This is all about putting raw material out there so that it can be used and reused by researchers, by curators, by platforms like Art UK and others. So this is really a kind of business to business service that is taking data from museums in as raw a form as possible, and then just making it available for any and all uses. And key to that, making those records useful, is that we have assigned a unique persistent identifier to each one. Actually, I've gone ahead in my slide there, which is just down at the bottom. So that's a shareable persistent link to that record, and we've used the Perl persistent URL format here. So you can click on that link and it will always resolve to a version of that record on the website. And that's a really important fundamental principle of what's called fair data, making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, that you need to have that kind of fixed, unchanging address online that you can refer to. So we've done that, and all the records that come into the Museum Data Service will have those persistent identifiers, which makes them really, really useful in a way that just simply having something on your own website, which might change its domain name, is not so useful. Other ways of using the data, you can download a CSV of key fields so that you can work with the data offline. So that's going to be really, really useful for people working on exhibitions or other kind of research. And later this month, we'll be launching an API which will allow web developers and researchers to access fuller data sets and use them elsewhere. So this is really, you can see that actually this takes using collections data well beyond simply posting it on a website so that people can read it and look at it. It's all about taking this massive data that exists out there, putting it into a form that makes it as useful as possible for all and any uses. This is just a quick summary of kind of what's going on behind the scenes. So we've got a load of museums, and we're open to museums and museum-like institutions. We have an entirely bespoke onboarding process, so there's no kind of one size fits all. And the data lives in a big repository called the SIM from Knowledge Integration. And then some of the data that museums are willing to make public then goes out to the public website that I just showed you. Now, it's a really important principle that we're not processing the data more than we need to, but we do need to do a little bit of light mapping because we're getting data in from lots of different databases and they call the same concept by different field names. So for example, we might have one data set come in where the place where an object is made is called place made. Another database might call it production place. So we need to do a little bit of light mapping. And what we've chosen to do is use Spectrum and its 500 units of information just as a kind of pragmatic solution. So in this case, the relevant Spectrum unit of information will be object production place. And Aaron, who'll be one of the panelists later, Aaron Rees, our museum data officer, has been mapping the incoming data sets. And so far, that pragmatic solution seems to work and makes the data from all sorts of disparate and diverse databases more useful because we know where to look for the information that deals with the same kind of concept. So that will give a real head start to anybody who wants to kind of work with this data going forwards. And I should also say that what's going on in the public website is just the tip of the iceberg. So a lot of the use of this collections data will actually happen behind the scenes, and we've got very elaborate procedures in place that allow databases to be locked down field by field to one of 4 permission levels. So you could, for example, upload your whole database to the Museum Data Service. You could make some fields public, but actually you could restrict other things that you're not quite ready to make public or which are confidential, but you could share those with volunteers, members of staff, trusted colleagues in other museums that you're working with. So this mitigates many of the problems that we currently have with sharing information and collaborating. And I noticed in the Mentimeter question that Sarah posed right at the start that collaboration was looming large as the number 1 word that people were putting in. And so this will be a means of people collaborating with data which isn't in the public domain, but is nonetheless made more accessible than it currently is if it's just sat on a standalone desktop in a museum. So moving to the 4th layer of our hierarchy, the related data. I mean, this is just an enormous potential wealth of knowledge. And for kind of for institutions which kind of are sometimes known as memory institutions, museums are really, really forgetful and not to say willfully negligent with a lot of the knowledge that they produce. Now, I've used this slide before, and those of you who've seen me talk before and have seen this slide, apologies, but in the spirit of reusing digital content, I'm going to use it again because it's really good. And the point that was being made here in 1997 is that museums put an awful lot of effort into producing fantastic audience-focused content. And then as soon as the exhibition opens, that content tends to be just forgotten and gathering digital dust in spreadsheets and Word documents. So there's a real opportunity both to kind of reclaim and repurpose legacy content, but also to kind of introduce tools that would allow people to actually implement and put into practice this minimum requirement of Spectrum use of collections, which is that you are adding the knowledge gained while you're using collections to catalogue records. And that's really, really difficult at the moment. It's museums of all sizes and using all kinds of different systems find it really difficult to deal with any kind of knowledge that isn't typed directly into the field of a collection management system. But the Museum Data Service does actually offer a potential route to this. So my colleague Katie Brown is going to be talking about an experiment that we're currently doing with a simple tool that allows museums to work with collection records to create new content based on those collection records, and then to send that content back to the Museum Data Service, where it can live as a digital asset in its own right with its own persistent identifier, but importantly linked back to the source object records that it relates to. So really fulfilling that Spectrum requirement, whether or not you then choose to bring that back into your own collection management system. It could just live in the in the Museum Data Service as linked data. So Katie will say more about that later on. And finally, images, and just to sort of preempt questions that and comments that I know we'll get, just to sort of clarify, the Museum Data Service won't be storing images, and that is simply on the grounds of cost. So we can just about afford to store 80 million text records and multiple versions of those and other text arising from them. But once you start bringing in the storage of high resolution images, video, and other digital assets, then you know, it just rises exponentially. So we are aware that it's a need. We're kind of lobbying hard for solutions to that. It's a bigger problem than we can solve, and it really needs kind of coordinated action really by, you know, policymakers and funders. And we have some thoughts on that. But where images do exist and they are stored and they are accessible, then if those links are in the source data that comes into the Museum Data Service, then of course users of the service can access those images. But I just thought I'd better clarify that. So coming up to time, I just want to now summarize. So the Museum Data Service, I think, is a real game changer, and we've really thought about why past initiatives haven't worked, why they haven't been sustainable. We think we've got an answer that works at, you know, every level. From, okay, we've now got, you know, the beginnings of what could be an open source, you know, authoritative data set of just the museums in the country and what they're called and the different names and how they relate to each other. We've got a framework for capturing existing information at collections level, which is in itself fantastically useful as a resource, just to try and understand the scope and the scale and the strengths and the weaknesses and the gaps of holdings across museum collections. We're starting to pull together, you know, individual object records, and can you just imagine how useful it will be to have, you know, access to pretty much all the object records from all museums for things like, you know, making decisions about what to acquire, what to dispose of. At the moment, everybody's flying blind. We don't really know what's in anybody else's collection. When we've got all the object records, we'll be able to do that. And there's going to be some conversation on the panel later about, you know, how that might be a game changer. And then finally, you know, we've got, at least regarding text content, just the beginnings of infrastructure to just capture and preserve and make accessible just the wealth of content, which is the, you know, the really, you know, interesting content that museums have been creating for decades and will continue to create, but at the moment it's just slipping through our fingers. So I think this really is a game changer, and I'm really just looking forward now to sort of hearing the rest of the day and to kind of taking questions later and talking to people about, you know, how we can now take these tools and really use them to put collections data to work. So thank you.